Hi everyone, welcome to this first McCord Discovery activity. John Howard Willis and Alexandre Vattemare, an artist, meet a collectioner. Through this virtual lecture series, our museum expert will share their recent discovery about the collection and the archives. Through those lectures, our public learns about a new and often overlooked dimension of our collection and gain a better understanding on the museum object and documents. I introduce myself, Leila Friat. I'm a project manager, education, community engagement, and cultural program for the McCord Museum. First and foremost, I would like to acknowledge that we are on an unceded indigenous territories and that the Ganyengeyaga Nation has an historical attachment to the territory. It is called Jojage. Those lands were and are a gathering place for many indigenous nations and their ancestors. We pay respect to them and those of other communities who may be with us today. I'm very happy to be able to meet you for this virtual event, for which I have the great pleasure to welcome Anne McKay. Anne is the head of conservation at the McCord Museum in Montreal, where she oversees all conservation and preservation activities. She's a member of the Canadian Association of Professional Conservation, accredited in the conservation of sculptures, and has published and lectures widely on conservation issues. She is an associated editor for the Journal of Canadian Association of Conservation, and she has taught courses on the history and theory of art of conservation at Concordia University. Just before I'm heading over to our guest, I would like to inform you that this activity will last 45 minutes. It will be in English, and it will be followed by a 15 minutes Q&A that can be addressed both in French and in English via our Zoom platform and on the Facebook page of the museum. Anne, I'll let you go.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Leila, and welcome everybody. I'm delighted to be able to share with you today some research on 4 watercolors from the McCord collection that entered into the collection in 2002. This project is close to my heart, and in thinking about that, I realized that that's because it allows me to do 2 of my favorite things here at the McCord. The first is that I get to spend hours looking at and thinking about objects and asking questions like, how can an object speak through its materials? Or what does its materiality tell us about its life? So my second favorite thing is that in thinking about and looking at objects, I get to make connections. And these can be connections between an object and an idea, or an object and a person, or a place, or a time. But more importantly, I get to make connections with people like yourselves. So thank you for tuning in. In the dead of winter of 1841, the internationally renowned French entertainer and philanthropist Alexandre Vattemare arrived in Quebec City and stayed for 1 month. Vattemare had come to promote his ideas regarding the international exchange of knowledge, and he immediately engaged in a busy schedule of meetings, social events, and popular performances. During this time, he developed a warm relationship with the artist and writer John Howard Willis and acquired a number of his watercolors depicting local and Indigenous people, 4 of which are now in the McCord collection. This afternoon, I would like to relate the story of this meeting and share the watercolors with you. I will also trace the ways in which the works cast light on the history of colonialism in Lower Canada, how in fact they are part of the dynamics of a settler relationship with the land and the Indigenous peoples on it, as it is structured and represented both in the past and in our society today. I'll start with a material examination of the watercolors, which is the genesis of my personal journey with my subject matter, and where much information about the works was gleaned early in the research. They are very similar in format, with a single figure occupying almost all the ground. 3 subjects are identified as Indigenous persons, one here on the left as a Canadian voyageur. The watercolors are freely and confidently painted with very little underdrawing. And here we can see just a hint of a pencil in the sleeve of one of the figures. Shadows are boldly delineated, and details of costume and accessories are described with sure and rapid brushstrokes. Highlighted and textured areas are incised into or scratched through the medium to the paper below, as we can see here in the highlights on the belt. The artist also added extra gum to certain areas, either to give gloss to some elements or to deepen and saturate shadows. This is obvious here where the gum applied to the deep shadow of the blanket fold has yellowed. All the works have inscriptions in sepia ink at the bottom of the page. The penmanship of the inscriptions is consistent and distinctive, with lots of underlining and periods. The artist always notes the occupation of his subject and their location in the colonial territory, information that was unquestionably of interest to him. Tracing the 4 locations noted on the works on a modern map suggests that they were made during a trip along the St. Lawrence River. The support is a high quality cream paper. This image gives you an idea of its fine texture. Looking at the paper with transmitted light brought into evidence 2 partial watermarks, which lined up perfectly to read Watman, Turkey Mills, 1834, highlighted here so it is easier to see, indicating that the works were painted after that date. Given the watermark and the similar size of the McCord's 4 works, we can surmise, looking at lists of historic paper sizes, that the artist could well have used a colombier sheet, which measured 23 by 34 inches, and cut it into 16 pieces, as illustrated here. A set of these smaller pre-cut sheets would have been easy to pack and use on a trip. The limited palette of the works, consisting of a black, 2 brown iron oxides, 2 reds, and a blue, is an indication that the artist probably used a small traveling kit of pans or cakes of prepared watercolors, like this one, a convenience available to artists through purchase from companies such as Winsor & Newton or Rowney since the end of the 18th century. Although these papers and paints were manufactured in England, artists in Quebec could purchase them through merchants such as William Cowan and Son. Here is a Cowan advertisement from 1839 listing a variety of stationery and art supplies, and here highlighted are watercolors, hair pencils, superior drawing pencils, drawing paper, stumps, chalk, etc., etc. 2 of the works have additional inscriptions, rough color pencil sketch, and note here that the word pencil at this time also meant brush. So in other words, rough watercolor sketch, indicating that the watercolors were considered by the artist to be preparatory to different final works. Sadly, I've come to believe now that no such work exists. Examination of the backs of the watercolors led to the discovery of this inscription on the back of one of them, hidden for years by the framing. To Monsieur Vattemare, Quebec, 1841, and a set of initials frustratingly illegible at the time. All that was clear, given the language of the inscription, was that its author must have been an English speaker. This kind of study often raises as many questions as it resolves. The questions after this examination were, who was Monsieur Vattemare? To whom did the initials belong? And under what circumstances did the gift of the watercolors occur? Alexandre Vattemare lived a life that today seems almost impossible. From modest beginnings in post-revolutionary France, he rose to the highest reaches of fame as a ventriloquist, later using his influence and wealth to promote the exchange of knowledge across national borders. At a very early age, young Alexandre discovered that he had a knack for throwing his voice and for vocalizing sounds, like the frying of eggs or the creaking of door hinges. Proving to be high-spirited in a rather difficult way at home, he was sent away, first to a seminary, then to medical school in Paris, from which he was soon expelled due to what seems to have been an irresistible urge to engage in such ghoulish pranks as making corpses on the dissection table talk. Nonetheless, in 1814, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, he was asked to accompany some wounded Prussian soldiers back to Berlin, where he became stranded due to the unforeseen consequences of the return of Napoleon to France. His decision to support himself by staging ventriloquism entertainments met with wide popularity, and in less than a year, he was touring across Europe. Vattemare's success as a performer under his stage name, Monsieur Alexandre, was unparalleled. He counted friends and acquaintances in the highest reaches of society, associating with famous writers and artists such as Goethe, Walter Scott, and Alexander Pushkin, and performing at numerous courts in Europe, including those of Queen Victoria and Tsar Nicholas I. The McCord has in its collection an early poster advertising a performance by Vattemare in 1823 in Bath. The Rogueries of Nicholas, or Les Russes de Nicolas, proved to be one of his most popular plays. As we can see here, Vattemare performed all the parts, young and old, male and female, executing quick costume changes and making the most of his ability to throw his voice. Here are two illustrations by the caricaturist Isaac Robert Cruikshank of characters from the entertainment, of course, played by Monsieur Alexandre. While on tour, Vattemare visited archives, libraries, and art collections and formulated the idea that would be the moving force for the rest of his life: the creation of an organization that would facilitate the exchange of knowledge through literature, scientific and government documents, objects, and art, and the establishment of institutions for its dissemination. At the same time, Vattemare was amassing his own collection of art, autographs, and numismatics, which he would eventually make available through the publication of the Album Cosmopolite, a work released in a series of 20 installments and made available to subscribers in Europe and the British Isles. Here are 2 pages from the album. On the left is a genre scene by an artist identified by Vattemare as Schnitt of Dordrecht. And on the right is an example of a page containing a reproduction of a medal and some autographs, including those of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. In 1839, Alexandre Vattemare sailed to North America to promote his ideas. Monsieur Vattemare brought with him letters of introduction, a portion of his collections, and the Album Cosmopolite to break the ice with those whom he hoped would be his new collaborators. Monsieur Alexandre brought the sets and costumes necessary for his performances. He landed in New York and visited over 50 American cities. In October 1840, he set out for Lower Canada, first arriving in Montreal and then traveling to Quebec City for a stay of about 1 month, from early February to March 4th, 1841. Vattemare's stay in Quebec City was highly anticipated. Word had spread from Montreal about this fabulous French philanthropist and cultural ambassador from the European metropolis, Paris. Vattemare was also an Anglophile who had lived in the British Isles for a number of years and so was connected in different but significant ways to the 2 colonizing peoples of Lower Canada. Vattemare arrived in the Canadas during a moment of political upheaval. In the years leading up to the rebellion of 1837, the citizens of Lower Canada had been divided over the form their government should take, to go to full representation or to continue with the colonial model that included appointed councils. This is a portrait of Louis-Joseph Papineau, head of the Parti Patriote and leader of the rebel forces. The population still bore the scars of the rebellion. Battles had been fought, lives lost, and jail terms, banishment, and execution had been meted out by the government. In 1841, many in Lower Canada were against the imminent union of the 2 Canadas, which the legislature would ratify later that year, fearing that their culture would be smothered by an English majority, and in Montreal and Quebec, language remained an important source of political tension. During this time, Indigenous peoples in the colonial territory were living a moment of rapid change and increasing pressure on their autonomy and political agency. Here is a print of Nicolas Vincent, a Huron-Wendat leader and diplomat who negotiated for his community both before the legislature in Lower Canada and at the court of George IV in London. During the 19th century, Indigenous peoples had been important military allies to French and English settlers. However, a growing British Army presence, coupled with an explosion in population, Lower Canada doubled its population between 1814 and 1844, led settlers in Lower Canada to see Indigenous people less as important allies and more as holders of land and resources who blocked unbridled expansion into the colonial territory. The union of the two Canadas was just one in a number of political events leading ultimately to confederation that would solidify settler hegemony. Even though much of the political agitation in Lower Canada was directed to attaining representational government, Indigenous people did not have the right to vote and were unable to protect their interests through normal processes of government. Indigenous leaders continually protested this imposition of a Western political system and the failure of the settler establishment to adhere to previous legal agreements made within that system, but to little avail. In this climate of discord and division, the arrival of Vattemare was highly anticipated by settlers as a moment of cultural advancement. Newspaper articles outlined his proposal: the creation of an institute that would unite the three major cultural institutions in Quebec City at that time, these being the Mechanics Institute, the Literary and Historical Society of Quebec, and the Quebec Library, and make them democratically open to all. The Institute would also be the organization through which international exchanges would take place. This, according to the journalist Napoleon Aubin, would, and I quote, prove the extinction of those feuds which have so long proved the bane of this province. On February 13th, the Quebec Mercury gave more details. The Vattemare Institute would house a library, a museum of natural history, a gallery of paintings, a hall to be set apart for the permanent exhibition of new or improved products of domestic industry, an amphitheater in which courses of public lectures may be delivered, of a nature to initiate by degrees all classes of the population in the theory of those arts. Vattemare was a master in the promotion of his cause, attracting general attention first through the exhibition of his album Cosmopolite and the staging of well-advertised performances. During his month in Quebec City, Monsieur Alexandre mounted the stage 4 times, performing in English, in French, and bilingually. Papers reported that on February 22nd, he also performed extracts from some of his entertainments at a ball of the Grenadier Guards held at the Citadel, much to the delight of the attendees, and surely the glittering highlight of his visit. 2 pieces of historical evidence from Vattemare's stay permitted the identification of the artist of the watercolors as John Howard Willis. The first is an ode to Vattemare, a poem published in the Quebec Mercury of February 20th and signed J.W.H., one of the possible combinations of initials in the dedication to Vattemare on the watercolor. The other is a poster announcing Vattemare's last appearance in Quebec City on March 2nd at the Legislative Assembly, which has a list of names of those who subscribed ahead of time to the meeting. This list is a snapshot of settlers in Quebec City in 1841 and is a fascinating study in and of itself. For our purposes today, I'll focus on the center columns here. People are a bit of a mix, with grocers and innkeepers rubbing shoulders with knighted politicians and famous doctors. We have 2 important artists, Antoine Plamondon and Thomas Berger, and at the top, among a group of people who appear to have lived in his neighborhood, is a certain J.H. Willis, an entry that delivered my bingo moment in the identification of the artist of the McCord watercolors. Alexandre Vattemare, despite his relative obscurity today, is still remembered by certain historians and archivists. His irrepressible personality and his eventful life allow him to leap off the pages of history into our time. John Howard Willis requires more patient coaxing out of the archive. Willis was an essayist, a short story writer, and a poet, active between the mid-1820s and the mid-1840s. Until this current research, his career as an artist was unknown. His day job was clerk at the Commissariat Department in Quebec City. This organization was responsible for the transport of goods throughout the province, supplying troops and government offices. Willis was employed as a conductor, or a person who accompanied shipments of provisions to their final destination to ensure that they arrived on time and complete. These trips for the company would, of course, have taken him regularly up and down the St. Lawrence River. The decisive evidence regarding the relationship between Vattemare and Willis is to be found in two letters in the archives of Montreal. These letters are a treat and are worth reading in full, as they are overabundant in information about the subject at hand. The first, dated February 15th, comes from the Commissariat office. My dear sir, according to my promise made to you on Saturday in Monsieur Plamondon's atelier, I herewith send you a few of my humble pen scratchings of costumes, roughly colored, which I hope you will do me the honor of accepting, not for their merits, certainly, as works of art, but as faithful transcripts of certain of our native costumes in this part of the world, outre enough, you will admit. I have selected these from my portfolio, from among a heap of similar rough sketches made on the moment, and to serve as materiel for finished drawings, etc., at a future day. Before you leave this for Europe, I hope to be able to present you with a few finished and more interesting subjects than these, and for any artistical deficiency they possess, allow my respect and esteem for yourself and philanthropic views to plead, being assumed that I hope to do something better for you before you leave us. We'll return to the remarkable contents of this letter, but let's now go on to the next one, dated a week later. My dear sir, enclosed are a few slips with my humble rhymes, which I have purposely struck off, that you may show your friends at some future period that even in this frigid clime, your talents would waken up the muses. I have some more drawings in progress for you. Turn over, P.S. I hope you will not deem me trop exigeant, as fortune, among her scant favors to me in this life, had denied me the slightest pretensions to be called a millionaire. As some members of my little family would wish to witness your extraordinary displays of art before you pass away from us to your own land, would you kindly oblige me with an order for 3 for tomorrow evening's performance, and I shall be thankful. You can leave it at our mutual friend Delcour's at your leisure, en passant for me. And here again, we see that illegible monogram now deciphered, J.H.W. So John Howard Willis, by his own account, created numerous watercolor sketches of Indigenous people on his trips for the Commissariat office. He also published in newspapers and journals, and in 1831 brought out a book of prose and poetry entitled Scraps and Sketches, or the Album of a Literary Lounger. Some of these texts have Indigenous subject matter, so Willis is a particularly interesting figure as a settler who represented Indigenous people, both in his writing and his art. I'd like to look at Willis's work using the concept of the settler imaginary. This idea, developed by Avril Bell, springs from the work of Charles Taylor and his broader notion of the social imaginary. Social imaginaries are the ways people imagine their social existence, how they fit together with others, how things go on between them and their fellows, the expectations that are normally met, and the deeper normative notions and images that underlie these expectations. The social imaginary, then, is the set of ideas, beliefs, and values that people use to define themselves and to further reinforce the political, social, and cultural structures that embed these concepts in their community. These notions are woven into all aspects of a community's life and are expressed in a myriad of ways, including literary and artistic production. The settler imaginary is a specific form of the social imaginary occurring in settler colonial societies like ours in Canada, and is, according to Bell, the set of ideas and values that underpin a peculiarly settler discourse of nationhood, identity, and Indigenous settler relations. It describes the settlers' conception of their identity and place in the world and the identity and place of the other, or of the Indigenous people already on the land. The settler imaginary is a self-perpetuating structure that most of the time is invisible to those living it. Two things are central in the settler imaginary. First is the projection of ideas which have their origin entirely in the settler world onto Indigenous people and communities. And second is the adoption of key aspects of Indigenous identity to claim authenticity and rootedness for the settler community. As we will see, these ideas and concepts are often contradictory and offer the faults that will allow us to crack open and look more closely at the construct of the settler imaginary. I'll start by looking at the best known of these contradictions, that of the Indigenous person as either noble and inherently virtuous, or ignoble and debased. This trope is common currency in settler societies and defines Indigenous identity using imposed stereotypes, rather than recognizing it as something inherent and possessing its own agency. Willis's writing certainly makes use of these concepts, sometimes tapping into both in the same text. Here is a passage from a short story describing a young soldier wandering along the banks of the St. Charles River at Quebec. He perceived a band of Indians, the foremost bearing the form of a fainting woman in his grasp. He was a Frenchman and an officer, and met the dark and powerful savage with his shrinking prey. A pistol shot, and the yelling demon staggered and dropped his seeming lifeless burden. But while he was yet falling, in the revengeful energy of his dying agony, he sank his whirling tomahawk deep in the young man's shoulder. Counter to this, the following passage about the daughter of an Indigenous leader who shows the latent pride and haughty daring of her noble, savage race, inherited from one whose blood for countless generations had flown unsullied from the source of such ennoblement, yes, and is jealously regarded in its high-toned obligations of honorable bearing by these wild people as that of the untainted ancestry of Europe's proudest peers. In his writing, Willis consistently imposes generalizing traits on his Indigenous characters, who are most often created to act as convenient foils for his settlers, and then spells out their fate in the settler community. The ignoble Indigenous person is dark, powerful, and revengeful, and represents a force the settler must destroy if he is to survive. The noble is not necessarily a threat, as long as this personage somehow exists on a higher plane and in a different eternalized time. If Indigenous people are denied agency, they are also denied place. Nomadic, difficult to locate, and able to melt into the landscape, Indigenous people in the settler imaginary are understood as unsettled, leaving the land empty for occupation. Willis's Indigenous characters often appear out of nowhere or perform unseen actions or disappear back into the landscape. Here's a passage from another short story describing the movement of two Indigenous characters across a landscape, who glided away into the wood like a spirit of darkness, urging their fresh and willing steeds at fearful speed along peculiar tracks in that wild wilderness, which none but the practiced and piercing eye of an Indian could trace. They continued on, and it was only after a vast extent of forest had been passed, and they emerged upon the brow of a narrow and wooded valley, that the warrior reined in his panting horse. Tirelessly moving, appearing and disappearing, impossible to trace, the settler imaginary envisions Indigenous people as being an indissoluble part of nature, in a relationship with the land that can be disregarded easily. Against this, the settler is distinct from nature, both apart and above, and from that position can claim control and proprietorship of the land through actions and laws that are not available to his Indigenous counterpart. It is not only the indigenous presence that must be repudiated. In the settler imaginary, other racial or social types are also seen as a threat to the stability and authority of the colony. In the short story, The Last of the Voyageurs, published in Scraps and Sketches and then reprinted in the journal, The Literary Garland in 1840, deals with the notion of the hybrid character. And here's one of our watercolors that connects in an interesting way with this story. The hybrid character, that disturbing type that cannot be neatly categorized. It describes a voyageur living out his last days in the backwoods who relates to the narrator of the story a tale within a tale about his experience during an ill-fated canoe transport involving a convergence of voyageurs, company men, and an enigmatic clerk who comes to a tragic end. The story makes parallels between Indigenous people and Canadian voyageurs and their future in the colony. There are hints at such parallels even in its title, which is inspired by that of James Fenimore Cooper's famous book published in 1826, The Last of the Mohicans, which Willis obviously read and was deeply influenced by. In his story, Willis directly evokes the character of Natty Bumppo, or Hawkeye, the hero of The Last of the Mohicans, the European descendant on American soil who has learned and absorbed the moral qualities and practical knowledge of the Indigenous people he has lived with for so many years. According to Cooper, Hawkeye is destined to disappear, as will Indigenous peoples, with the westward advancement of settlers. Willis's narrator reminisces about seeing voyageurs in Montreal in this descriptive passage. 10 or 15 years ago, the appearance of this class of people crowding the streets of Montreal on their occasional return from long and distant voyages in the interior must be yet strong and vivid. Their wild and half-savage mien, an affected Indian style of costume, the long shaggy hair, bronzed and ferocious cast of feature, so weather-beaten and so recklessly scowling forth from under the hood almost hidden beneath the mass of feathers or tails. All these are, in a manner, passed away from us now, for they have become things of rarity, a waning existence elsewhere. In this evocation of the hybrid, Willis places the voyageur firmly in the camp of the other, an outre presence, to use his term, which is inevitably fading in the memory of those who move forward. Furthermore, his description of the old voyageur's canoe travel in this story is consistent with depictions of Indigenous peoples disappearing into the landscape. Willis's narrator describes the figures of the ancient voyageur and his hound in their slight and scarcely perceptible conveyance, gliding as if under a motionless impulse around the point of the wooded headland that stretched away into the lake. If the reader has any questions regarding the ultimate fate of the hybrid in colonial society, the climax of the story neatly resolves this quandary. One of the clerks on the transport, described as a tall, slender boy of beautiful countenance, with eyes that affected one strangely to look upon, turns out to be a cross-dressing woman in pursuit of her lover, a wealthy man accompanying the expedition. The voyageur relates her fate after witnessing a passionate confrontation between the two on a cliff high above a torrent. The next moment, he fiercely caught up the slight and yielding form of his victim, which seemed like an infant in a giant's grasp, as he rushed to the edge of the rock and furiously hurled her into the roaring and raging destruction beneath. What is the way forward when, in the settler imaginary, Indigenous and hybrid inhabitants melt into or are violently expelled from the land? Settler societies are then free to envision the passing on of what has been called the mantle of authenticity, to assume the identity that will allow them to become the true possessors of the land and the traditions proper to it. The humorous essay, Snowshoes, was published in Scraps and Sketches and reveals how seemingly innocuous pastimes like snowshoeing enter the settler imaginary and situate the colonial presence firmly on the land and in its environment. Willis opens with a fictitious epigraph at the top of the page here, obviously his creation, but purporting to be a translation of an Indigenous manuscript. thereby establishing snowshoeing as an Indigenous activity. He goes on to assert the suitability of snowshoeing for the male settler, chiding those whose lax indoor habits he condemns as enfeebling, listing evening entertainments, reading and dozing by the fire, and the dandyish predilections of tandem drivers. He instead advocates venturing out into the bracing winter landscape on a pair of snowshoes. If you wish to get your calves into killing order, if you covet the happy possession of a face that savors not of a charnel house in color and hue, if you have the slightest idea of measuring 21 3/4 over the breadbasket and 3 feet across between your shoulder blades, go to and buy you a pair of snowshoes. Willis lists a good blanket capot, red, blue, or blanket leggings, moose moccasins, caribou mittens, a soft fox or raccoon skin skullcap, and interestingly, the application of a dash of vermilion in either cheek, bringing to mind an outfit that mirrors closely the clothing of the Indigenous hunter in this watercolor. The rejection of what Willis terms tip-top fashionable toggery signals the birth of the virile settler who, having shaken off habits more suited to life in the old world metropolis, will legitimately master this land of snowshoes and frosty snowstorms and frosty winds. Willis is prescient here, writing over a decade before the creation of the first snowshoeing club in Lower Canada in 1843, and several decades before the height of the popularity of the sport in the colony, especially among Anglophone male settlers. His essay is an early contribution to that element of the settler imaginary that sinks borrowed roots into new land to bring forth a narrative of authentic belonging. One woman is represented in the 4 watercolors. The nature of this depiction of a woman with child carrier and basket sets it apart from the others, in that it disconcertingly reveals the unexamined assumptions and prejudices brought to the fore by the intersection of race and gender in the settler imaginary. Settler societies are patriarchal, and certainly in the 19th century allowed little agency to women. The stereotypical saint-sinner binary applied to women in settler culture has blighted settler understanding of women's roles in Indigenous cultures up to this day. In the settler imaginary, the contrast between the two sides of this patriarchal coin, when applied to Indigenous women, is stark. Willis devotes much of his writing, stories, poetry, and essays, to the description of European or Euro-Canadian women, and without exception in the praise of their physical form and moral refinement. Here is a description of an Englishwoman from a short story in Scraps and Sketches. There was a deep-toned feeling in the flashing of her large eyes, which spoke of high thoughts and proud resolve. The fine aquiline nose, the dark and full arching eyebrow, the high unpolished forehead, the waxen fairness of her cheek, with one little glow of carnation. Her form was tall, somewhat, I may say, voluptuous, but yet strictly proportionate and beautiful in its contour. In his texts, Willis's Indigenous female characters are described invariably as princesses or daughters of chiefs, and as in the example we looked at earlier, are always beautiful and noble of character. However, we find no arching brows or voluptuous curves in these passages. Instead, Willis relies on generalized comparisons to nature, evoking young maples by the mountainside, slender willow branches bending over creeping rivulets, and midnight skies. But in rendering this figure, in putting brush to paper, Willis allows himself to indulge in the underside of the princess narrative, showing both unease and mockery in this portrayal of a woman who is threatening not because of violence, but because she does not fall into settler conceptions of the female. This woman, in fact, seems to be in the process of making a living by selling baskets, and I am sure I'm not alone to notice that she is the one figure of the 4 we have seen who is multitasking. John Howard Willis died in July 1847 during a typhus epidemic in Quebec City, 2 years after the death of his wife, Julia. Here is his death notice published in the Quebec Mercury on July 3rd. On the 2nd instant, John Howard Willis, Esquire, many years a clerk in the Commissariat Department, age 44 years. He possessed scientific attainments of a superior order. Friends and acquaintances are requested to attend the funeral on Sunday at 2:00 p.m. from his late residence on Couillard Street. Google tells me that possessing attainments of a superior order, whatever they may be, is commonplace commendation in the 19th century, and it could be that this tribute is simply heartfelt praise of a general sort. But it is the word scientific that brings the 21st century reader up short. Clerk, writer, artist, what scientific attainments did Willis possess? And for that matter, what did the author of this obituary mean by the word scientific? In fact, in 1847, science had still not entirely settled into the modern definition we know today. Enlightenment scientists during the 18th century were responsible for pushing forward the evolution of scientific pursuit from an ancient model based on deduction from principles to a more inductive process involving experimentation and close observation. The classification of the natural world was codified during this time to include systems categorizing plants, animals, and even humans. Willis's insistence on the accuracy of his depictions is interesting. In his letters to Vattemare, he maintains that his watercolors are not works of art, but faithful transcripts made on the moment. Willis wanted to be sure that Vattemare would know that he had observed carefully and rendered with truth. The watercolors betray a deep proto-anthropological interest in his subjects. Willis portrays their clothing and the tools of their trade in paint, and defines their occupation and location in the titles. The latter are consistently inscribed below the figures, similar to many scientific illustrations, such as botanical prints, or closer to our subject, to illustration of national and regional costume. Books on this subject were very popular in the early 19th century. These volumes contain illustrations of dress in regions of Europe that were remote, or countries like China that were distant and unknown. Traditional costume, not changeable fashion, was of interest to the cosmopolitan European consumer of these images, who would have been able to glean information about unchanging, distant, and exotic places and peoples, taking cues from the idiosyncrasies of their clothing. Far from centers of power and progress, many of these regions were in fact ripe for European expansion and colonization. Willis's production exemplifies this colonial gaze, and it is very possible that the work at a future day he refers to in a letter to Vattemare would have been such a volume. No wonder Vattemare was attracted to the watercolors and would have wanted to include them in his art collection or even use them as objects of exchange. The images were scientific in the sense that Willis was accruing knowledge about the indigenous people he met, recording his observations accurately, and systematically classifying this information in the visual typology of the other. In his art and writing, Willis chronicled, however through a glass darkly, the world around him. His work is an integral part of the fabric of the settler imaginary, woven seamlessly into, as Taylor says, the ways people imagine their existence, how they fit in with others, and the underlying assumptions they make about how things must be. The settler imaginary has roots in the past, but it is not historical. It is a structure, a system, if you will, which is still here with us today. We recognize in Willis's work colonial attitudes and assumptions that have reverberated through history, through the 19th, the 20th, and the 21st centuries, now arriving at our own doorstep. Teasing apart the components of this system, whatever form they may take, will help us better understand and dismantle the colonial project, strand by strand. Thank you.
And thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your research. It's a fascinating process you went through. And we have a couple of minutes for questions. I have a first comment that I want to share with you from Jeanette Anderson, which is I've seen many webinars, and this is the best. Bravo McCord, bravo.
Oh.
I have to say,
Thank you.
It's a fabulous, really fabulous research from Marie Trottier. And maybe while people build their question, I have a question about the research itself. What is the next steps that you would like to do in that research on the Vattemare work?
Yes. The amazing thing about this project is that it's gone in multiple directions. There is really so much to do. Certainly, just very basically, some basic work to be done in Vatemare's collecting in Lower Canada, because we don't know that much about it. But I have taken steps to finding out a little bit more about what he collected and why. The unfortunate thing is that you would think that the Vattemare collection would still be intact somewhere, but it's not. When Vattemare returned to Paris, he did stage exhibitions of his North American material, and we do have catalogs from those exhibitions. So we have some idea of some of the things that he collected. But on his death, Alexandre Vattemare, despite all his wealth and his fame, ended up pouring all his money into his International Bureau of Exchange and worked basically to his death later on in the century. So when he died, his collection was auctioned off to raise money. So his collections were dispersed. So the research has to really be archival and trace sources and provenance wherever we can. So there are various archives. The New York Public Library has a great Vattemare archive, as does the Bibliothèque Administrative de la Ville de Paris, also has a lot of information. So a lot of research on that would be done through archives, and I think this is where I would like to go next.
And there was a question from Ghislaine Laflamme. Est-ce que tous les tableaux sont exposés au musée présentement?
Non, malheureusement, ce n'est pas le cas. Nous avons les aquarelles dans nos réserves, mais ça serait vraiment génial un jour de pouvoir les exposer. C'est juste que nous sommes limités à cause des sujets de nos expositions. Alors, nous n'avons pas vraiment une exposition permanente sur toutes les collections du McCord. Alors, pas une opportunité de les voir, sauf que ces aquarelles sont disponibles, on peut les voir sur notre site web. Alors, je suggère à tout le monde, s'il s'intéresse à les voir plus proche, de peut-être consulter notre site web.
Est-ce qu'il y a un projet, c'est une question que je te pose, mais est-ce qu'éventuellement, ce serait un projet si tes recherches continuent de peut-être intégrer justement ou de faire un projet spécial qui puisse mettre en valeur les aquarelles?
Oui, je peux voir, l'utilisation de ces images, ça c'est sûr, et pas nécessairement juste sur une exposition sur John Howard Willis ou Alexandre Vattemare, mais dans nos expositions qui traitent de la décolonisation particulièrement, je peux voir qu'il y a vraiment des possibilités de leur utilisation dans nos expositions, absolument.
Est-ce que tu mènes en parallèle les recherches sur, je t'ai posé la question sur Vattemare, mais tu travailles principalement sur Willis. Est-ce que tu travailles parallèlement les deux ou tu les avances toujours conjointement? Ou est-ce que c'est un...
Sur Willis et Vattemare? Mais intéressant parce que quand j'ai débuté ma recherche, il n'y avait pas beaucoup sur Alexandre Vattemare qui était disponible. C'est sûr qu'il y avait les experts, mais c'était quelqu'un qui était un peu caché dans les archives. Mais depuis que j'ai amorcé la recherche, je vois que il y a encore de la recherche qui a été faite, beaucoup plus d'articles et sites web qui sont disponibles. Sauf que John Howard Willis, ça c'est quelqu'un qui n'est pas très bien connu et il me fascine beaucoup. Alors, je trouve les faits de sa vie très touchants et le fait que c'était vraiment un grand moment pour lui de rencontrer Alexandre Vattemare et c'était avec ce lien finalement que nous avons pu découvrir John Howard Willis. Alors, j'aimerais peut-être tirer un peu plus fort sur John Howard Willis pour son sortie des archives.
J'ai beaucoup de commentaires, Anne. Je t'invite à peut-être les regarder dans
oui, je les regarde très vite, mais
je pense que it's a conversation that is truly fascinating. It's an excellent use of the past and better understanding and improve the future.
Ah, merci.
That's one of the comment.
Oui.
Maybe if there is a last one, I'll just see. How did this work came into the McCord collection?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. The work was part of the collection of a curator emeritus here at the McCord, Peter Winkworth. And he worked for years at the McCord and had a fabulous collection of Canadiana. And he deposited some of his collection at the McCord Museum. And it was on his death that the McCord was able to acquire material that was very pertinent to our collecting mandate. So although I said that the watercolors came into our collection in 2002, but in fact, the watercolors had been here for much longer, but they were actually only acquired in 2002.
I have another question from Marie-Chantal Poisson. Are there any other watercolors from GHW in other collection elsewhere?
I've only found one, and I'd love to find others. So maybe this talk will maybe dig something up. But there is a watercolor in the National Gallery of Canada entitled Indian Voyageur. That's very evidently by the hand of John Howard Willis. But I haven't seen any other works that I could positively identify as being his.
Well, I think that's about the time that we have. Thank you so much, Anne, for once again for opening that door, that unknown door of the work of your research work in restoration. I would like to tell our public that it is now possible to visit the museum, although we don't have the watercolor that exposed. We have all the other exhibition. You could also see a virtual tour of our exhibition. Registration are available on the museum website. And I would also like to announce that we will have a next McCord discovery that will be in French. It's on May the 14th. It will be by Christian Vachon, which is Head Collection Management Curator Documentary Art. And it will be, the title of the conference is Montréal avant la photographie 1760-1840. So all information are also on the website. Once again, thank you so much everyone for being present for this virtual activity of the McCord Discovery. Anne, merci infiniment.
Merci beaucoup, Léla.
Read all of those great comments. I'll take a snapshot to keep it
okay.
for you.
Okay, great, thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you today. Merci tout le monde.
Merci beaucoup.